Good morning and welcome. It is Tuesday, April 14th, and today we are reading LYDDIE, chapter 21 called Turpitude. Last night in chapter 20, Bridget didn't come down from working, and LYDDIE ran back in the room, and Mr. Marston was doing to Bridget what he had been doing to LYDDIE. LYDDIE got mad, screamed his name, and threw a bucket of dirty water over his head. So here's the next day, what's going to happen to her. And in your journal, you'll be completing page 96 while we read, and I'll be going over some words that are on page 97. Now, the first word I see is turpitude. Now, if you see the word turpitude, that means you're somebody evil and vile. You're like a dirty girl or a dirty boy, and you don't do things that you're supposed to do. And that's kind of considered evil, especially at that time. You can be fired for doing things you're not supposed to be doing, to be honest with you. So that's what this is titled, starting on page 162. By morning the laughter was long past. She was awake and dressed, pacing the narrow corridor between the beds before the 4:30 bell. Her breath caught high in her throat and her blood raced around her body, undecided whether to run fire through her veins, searing her despite the November chill, or freeze to an icy rivulet of a mountain brook. So it's November, and she's burning up, searing, because she's so afraid of what's going to happen when she goes to work today. She could not touch her breakfast. The smell of fried codfish turned her stomach, but she sat there amidst the chatter and clatter of the mill because it was easier to pass the time in noise of the company than in the raging silence of her room. She was the first at the gate. It wasn't that she was eager for the day to begin, but eager for it to be over, for whatever was to happen, and she did not doubt that something dreadful must happen, for whatever must happen to be in the past. She tried not to think of Bridget. She could not take on Bridget's fate as well as her own. If only she had not come back up the stairs. Monster! Would I have wished to leave that poor child alone? Better to feed Rachel and Agnes to the bear. And yet Bridget was not a helpless child. She might have broken loose, stomped his foot, or, well, it was too late for that. LYDDIE had gone back. She had mercy on her, picked up that pail of filthy water and crammed it down on the overseer's neat little head. And all she had to do was speak. When she had called his name, she had turned and let Bridget go. But no, LYDDIE could not be satisfied. She had taken that pail and rammed it till the man's shoulders were almost squeezed up under the tin. The skin on her scalp crawled. Ugh! Why didn't they open the gate? She was as weary of the scene in her head as if she'd actually picked up that heavy bucket and brought it down over and over again and run the length of the yard, dragging Bridget behind her 1,000 times over. Laughing, of course. He must have heard her. She had howled like a maniac. He must have heard. The other operatives were crowded about, jostling her as they all waited for the bell. And still, when it rang, she jumped. It was so loud, so like an alarm clanging danger. She tried to turn against the tide, to get away while there was still time, but she was caught in the chattering, laughing trap of factory girls pushing themselves forward into the new day. She gave up and allowed the press of bodies around her to propel her up to the enclosed staircase and up the 4 flights to the weaving room. Bridget was not at her looms. Mr. Marsden was not on his high stool. Her execution was delayed. She felt relief and was immediately swallowed up in anxiety. She needed it all to be over. One of the girls from the acre approached her. Bridget says to tell you she's feeling a wee bit poorly this morning. You are not to worry. The little coward. She's going to let me face it all alone, eh? When I was the one who risked all to help her? The girl glanced back over her shoulder and around the room. She bent her face close to LYDDIE's neck and whispered, "The truth be told, she got word not to report this morning. She had no wish to alarm you." Oh, someone told her not to come to work. I wonder why they told her not to come to work. Now LYDDIE was truly alarmed, even without the slight armor of resentment that might provide. Would they then be punishing Bridget instead of her? What sin had Bridget committed? What rule had she ever trespassed? And she with a sickly mother and nearly a dozen brothers and sisters to care for. Mr. Marsden had come in. LYDDIE kept her eyes carefully on her looms. The room shook and shuddered into life. LYDDIE and the Irish girl beyond kept Bridget's looms going between them as best they could. She was almost busy enough to suppress her fears. And then a young man, the agent's clerk in his neat suit and cravat, appeared at her side and asked her to come with him to the agent's office. The time had come at last. She shut down her own looms and one of Bridget's, and followed the clerk down the stairs and out across the yard to the low building that housed the counting room and the offices. The agent Graves was seated at his huge roll-top desk and did not at once turn from his papers and acknowledge her presence. The clerk had only taken her as far as the door, so she stood just inside as he closed it behind her. She tried to breathe. She waited like that, hardly able to get a breath past her Adam's apple, until she began to feel quite faint. Would she collapse then in a heap on the rug? She studied the pattern, shades of dull browns, starting nearly black in the center and spinning out lighter and lighter to a dirty yellow at the outer edge. Dizzy, she stumbled a step forward to keep from falling. The man turned in his chair as though annoyed. He was wearing half spectacles, and he lowered his massive head and stared over them at her. You sent for me, sir?" It came out like a hen cackle. Cackle like a So, "Yes, you sent for me, sir?" She was glad to hear her voice grow stronger, and the man kept staring as though she were a maggot on his dish. "Lyddy Worthen, sir. You sent for me." "Ah, yes, Miss Worthen." He neither stood nor asked her to sit down. "Miss Worthen." He gathered the papers he had been working on and tamped the bottom of the pile on his desk to neaten it, and then laid the stack down on the right side of the desk. Then he scraped his chair around to face her more directly. "Miss Worthen, I have had a distressing interview with your overseer this morning." So distressing meaning hearing bad news, making him concerned. She couldn't help but wonder how Mr. Marsden had retold last night's encounter. "It seems," he continued, "it seems you are a troublemaker in the weaving room." He was studying her closely now, as closely as he had studied the papers before. "A troublemaker," he repeated. "I, sir?" "Yes. Mr. Marsden fears you are having a bad influence on the other girls there." So there had been no report of last night. Then at least seemed clear. "I do my work, sir," Lyddy said, gathering courage. "I have no intention of causing trouble on the floor." "How long have you been with us, Miss Worthen?" "A year, sir. Last April, sir." "And how many looms are you tending at this time?" "4, sir." "I see. And your wages, on the average?" "I make a good wage, sir. Lately it's been $3 above my board." "Are you satisfied with these wages, then?" "Yes, sir." "I see. And the hours?" "I'm used to long hours. I manage." "I see. And none of this," he waved a massive hand, "none of this 10-hour business, eh?" "I never signed a petition. I meant to, but no need for you to know it, sir." There was a long pause during which the agent took off his spectacles as though to see her better. "So," he said finally, "you are not one of those female reform girls?" "No, sir." "I see," he said, replacing his spectacles and looking quite as though he saw much less than he had a few minutes before. "I see." She took a tiny step forward. "May I ask, sir, why I'm being called a troublemaker?" She spoke very softly, but the agent heard her. "Yes, well, maybe," her heart thumped in admiration for her own boldness, "maybe Mr. Marsden could be called, sir. How is it exactly that I have displeased him?" Her voice went up to soften the request to a question. "Yes, well," he hesitated. "Open the door." And when Lyddy obeyed, he called to the clerk to summon Mr. Marsden, then turned again to Lyddy. "You may sit down, Miss Worthen," he said, and went back to the papers on his desk. Though the chair he indicated was narrow and straight, she was grateful to sit down at last. The spurt of courage had exhausted her as much as her fear had earlier. She was glad, too, to have time to pull her rioting thoughts together. But the longer she waited, the greater the tumult inside her. Tumult meaning the storm brewing, like she's getting extra nervous because she's having to wait for Mr. Marsden to come in. So that when the clerk opened the door and Mr. Marsden appeared, she could only just keep from jumping up and crying out. She pressed her back into the spindles of the chair until she could almost feel the print of the wood through her chest. She kept her eyes on the dizzying oval spiral of the rug. There was a clearing of the throat, and then, "You sent for me, sir?" Lyddy nearly laughed out loud. Her exact words not 10 minutes before. The superintendent turned in his chair, but again he did not stand or offer the visitor a chair. Miss Worthen here asked to know the charges against her. Mr. Marsden coughed. Lyddy looked up despite herself. At her glance the overseer blinked quickly, then composed himself, his lids hooding his dark little eyes, his rosebud mouth tightening to a slit. "This one is a troublemaker," he said evenly. She leapt to her feet. She couldn't seem to stop herself. "A troublemaker?" Then what you be, Mr. Marsden? What be you, eh?" The agent's head went up. His body was spread, and his eyes bulged like a great toad and poised to spring. "Sit down, Miss Worthen," and she sank onto the chair. Her outburst had given the overseer the time he needed. He smiled slightly as though to say, "See, no lady, this one." Satisfied that he had stilled her, the agent shifted his gaze from Lyddy to her accuser. "A troublemaker, Mr. Marsden?" For a quick moment Lyddy hoped, but the man went on. "In what way a troublemaker? Her work record seems satisfactory." "It is not." And now Mr. Marsden turned and glared straight at Lyddy, all trace of nervousness gone. "It is not her work as much. Indeed," and here he gave a sad little laugh, "I at one time thought of her as one of the best on the floor, but," he turned back to the agent, his voice solemn and quiet. Solemn meaning he's acting very serious right now, and he's lying right through his teeth. "I am forced, sir, to ask for her dismissal. It is a matter of moral turpitude." Moral turpitude meaning Lyddy has no morals. She's an evil little girl. She does bad things. Moral what? What was he saying? What was he accusing her of? "I see," said the agent, as though all had been explained when nothing had. "I cannot," and now the overseer's voice was fairly dripping with honey of regret, "for the sake of all the innocent young women in my care, I cannot have among my girls someone who sets an example of moral turpitude." "Certainly not, Mr. Marsden. The corporation cannot countenance moral turpitude." She turned unbelieving from one man to the other, but they ignored her. She fought for words to counter the drift the interview had taken, but what could she say? She did not know what turpitude was. How could she deny something she didn't even know existed? She knew what moral was, but that didn't help. Moral was Amelia's territory of faithful attendance at Sabbath worship and prayer meeting and Bible study, and she couldn't ask for consideration on those counts. She hardly ever went to worship, and Lord knew when she read it wasn't just the Bible. Still, she was no worse than Minnie, was she? At least she was not a Papist, and no one was condemning them. She opened her mouth. They were both looking at her sadly but sternly. In silence the battle had been lost. "You may ask the clerk for whatever wages are due you, Miss Worthen," the agent said, turning to his desk. Mr. Marsden gave his superior's back a nod and tight rosebud smile. Did he click his heels? At any rate, he left quickly without another glance toward Lyddy. "You may go now," the agent said without turning. What could she do? She stumbled to her feet and out the door. They paid her wages, full and just, but there was no certificate of honorable discharge from Concord Corporation, and with no certificate she would never be hired by any other corporation in Lowell. She walked out of the tall gate benumbed. She had often dreamed of this last day, but in her dream she would be going home in triumph, and now there was no triumph, and no home to go to, even in disgrace. So she's benumbed right now. She's like frozen, like what just happened? I don't even know what moral turpitude means. She doesn't even know what she's being called. She's being called nasty girl. Okay? All right. So go ahead and finish your assignment on page 96 and 97. See you later. Bye.